When I was a boy, I took piano lessons from my Aunt Marge, who played keyboard and had an organ in her home, in her little apartment. I have a sneaking suspicion that I was not a great piano student because after a short time, my mom sent me to a local convent, Assisi Heights in Rochester, to take piano from an elderly nun named Sister Maybelle Hodges. My best friend Dave also took piano from Sister Maybelle. So each week, he and I would ride our bikes up the enormous hill atop which sat this idyllic home of all those Catholic sisters. Like I said, I was a terrible piano student. I really had no interest in playing piano, so I wouldn't practice. And with no practice, there was no advancement of keyboard skill. Sister Maybelle had an extra piano room next to her piano studio. So Dave and I always bartered with one another to see who had to go first into the lesson. If you went second, you could squeeze in an extra 30 minutes of valuable practice time before the true suffering commenced. Sometimes it was the only practice one would have all week. Robert Farrar Capon once wrote, "The church, by and large, has had a poor record of encouraging freedom. The church has spent so much time inculcating in us the fear of making mistakes that it has made us like ill-taught piano students. We play our pieces, but we never really hear them because our main concern is not to make music, but to avoid some mistake that will get us into trouble. The church, having a need to do things always the right way, has made us care more about how we look than about who Jesus is." When you align a worldwide pandemic with an election year, one thing you get is a lot of talk about freedom. And that's good. Freedom is a very good thing. But Christian freedom and American freedom are not the same thing. The latter is a freedom of detachment, a freedom to express ourselves, to write, speak, hold an opinion, vote, or move about unfettered. But Christian freedom is not that. On June 15, 1520, the Roman Catholic Church issued a papal bull in which the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther was threatened to be charged as a heretic and ordered to halt his preaching. In response, Luther began to write even more ferociously than he had before. And one of the tracts that he authored was entitled "On the Freedom of the Christian." And that tract begins with these words. Luther wrote, "A Christian is an utterly free person, Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is an utterly dutiful person, servant of all, and subject to all." See, Luther saw Christ in all things. And he was impacted by the words of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, where Paul wrote, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone." And also in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus, being in the very nature of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant. As utterly free as Christ was, Luther reasoned, he also bound himself under the law to serve his creatures and win their salvation. And Christ's example becomes the form of Christian freedom. From the beginning of this pandemic, Celebration Lutheran Church has expressed its Christian freedom by binding ourselves to our most vulnerable neighbors. We closed our building to many events. We invested resources in quality online worship production, and we worshiped outside. A couple of those services were a little chilly. Sometimes the wind whipped up so hard, it was difficult to hear a live stream. And families who would have had one large, grand confirmation day graciously went along with our plan to hold multiple confirmations outdoors, so we could accommodate many people while keeping all of them safe. When I thanked the confirmation mom for being so understanding, she said, "We don't take anything for granted anymore. Anything we get to do is a bonus. Any soccer game, any event." And then she looked at me and she said, "This was fun." Now, the colder weather will steal the option of outdoor worship, and some will be glad and relieved that they can finally get back to worshiping in a sanctuary. Others will not feel comfortable coming inside, or will not be able to do so because they're immune compromised. And believe me, I totally understand both those situations. But I would be remiss if I did not say, as your pastor, that up until now, we have tried to shake ourselves loose from our fear of doing something wrong in order to express a freedom that is deeper and more powerful than the type that makes our nation great. We followed Christ's example, and we sacrificed a small bit of our comfort in worship to make sure that someone didn't get sick. We had to bundle up some Sundays. We had to look into the sun. We had to peel back plastic from communion elements, all which we did because we believe that our Christian freedom binds us to the care of our neighbor, and that outweighs our American freedom of choice. And I know that a parking lot pales in comparison to a comfortable pew and a beautiful sanctuary. In the same way, a cross could never compare to the heavenly comforts Christ left behind for our sake. But that's the choice our Savior made. And here at Celebration, we tried to have our choices mirror His. Now, barring a spike in virus cases in our community, come the first weekend of October, we'll most likely be back indoors worshiping here at Celebration. So please watch for the details. Your pastor, your church staff, and your lay leaders, we all thank you for your gracious spirit, your understanding, and your generosity. It's your closest witness to who Jesus is, and I appreciate it. This is Pastor Jeff, signing off from Celebration Sanctuary. This is our neighborhood.